Hello, everyone. This is going to be 8.1 Plans for Reconstruction Clash. We're going to start with the primary source from Senator Charles Sumner, one of the most radical of the radical Republicans. You might remember him as the guy who was nearly beaten to death with a cane before the Civil War. And he said, "The same national authority that destroyed slavery must see that this other pretension," he's talking about bigotry, "is not permitted to survive." Basically, he's saying we've eliminated slavery from our laws, now we have to eliminate racism from our hearts and from our minds. Our objectives. We're going to explain the multiple reasons why a plan was needed for Reconstruction in the South. We are going to compare the strengths and weaknesses of the Reconstruction plans of Lincoln, his successor, Andrew Johnson, and the radical Republicans in Congress. And we're going to discuss Johnson's political difficulties and finally his impeachment. So let's start with the whole idea of Reconstruction and what is Reconstruction. Reconstruction basically is the time period following the Civil War from about 1865 to 1877 in which America had to restitch itself back together, but also try to fix the South. So the South had been heavily damaged by the war. Also, slavery had ended. This was a massive shift in the way that they lived. Um, Enslaved people were, however, while they were freed, they were not yet citizens. And so there's a lot of questions that are being left unanswered at this time. And so the time period called Reconstruction, about 1865 to 77, this was a time where the federal government was reuniting the North and the South, trying to rebuild the economy, and debating what sort of rights the newly freed African Americans would have. So, what do we do to reunite the Union? To many Northerners, the question was, how do we make them come back? Do we welcome them back with open arms and say, God, we're so glad you're back? Or do we say, march them back at gunpoint, basically? Should it be easy for the South to come back, or should we make them work for it? Do they have to swear loyalty oaths? Do they have to pay money for reparations? Do they have to promise to treat African Americans in certain ways? Also, since we'd never really done this dance before, nobody knew who was supposed to be in charge of Reconstruction. Is it supposed to be, the president? Is it supposed to be Congress? Does the South get to decide how Reconstruction works? All of these are questions that are being asked at this time. So here is a political cartoon from the time called "Shall I Trust These Men?", where Lady Liberty is looking down at Robert E. Lee and several other several other Confederates and saying, "Shall I trust them?" We'll look at the other half of this political cartoon in a second. So the South had been ravaged by the Civil War, economically, militarily, personally, spiritually. The Union Army had burned down their farms, torn up their railroads, destroyed a lot of factories, a lot of farms, a lot of cities. And they lost a huge amount of men during the war as well. Now, the biggest thing they had left over after the war is land. And so the question becomes, who gets that land? Do we return it to the former slave owners, or do we divide it up among the freed African Americans? What do we do with this stuff? So, for instance, this is Richmond, Virginia at the end of the war. A lot of the big cities, there were not a lot of big cities in the South, but the ones that did exist, a lot of them were wrecked by the Civil War. Richmond, Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston. Some said that the former slaves should get it. So, especially a lot of radical Republicans and a lot of men like Frederick Douglass said, the slave owners were the one who started the war, so we should punish them by taking away their property and giving it to the people who they'd been oppressing for centuries. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union general after the war, proposed giving millions of acres of land to freed slaves in 40-acre plots. This is known as his Special Field Order number 15. He also said, we can give them some retired Army animals like mules. And so this became known as the promise of 40 acres and a mule. It was, however, never completed. While Sherman did start this process, freed slaves were given this land for a few years. However, white Northerners and white Southerners eventually came together to strip this land away from the freed African Americans and giving it back to the original owners. This is one of the things we can see is that Reconstruction started strong, but it had a lot of problems along the way. Today, if you hear the term 40 acres and a mule, it is particularly used by African Americans to discuss the idea of a broken promise or an unrealistic offer, that basically the United States did not follow through. It's oftentimes used when talking about paying money to African Americans for what their ancestors suffered during the war. Now, the 13th Amendment, which was passed before the end of the Civil War in January of 1865, freed African Americans. It said slavery is no longer a thing in America. However, it did not say what status these African Americans had in the country now. African Americans had not been given citizenship by the 13th Amendment, nor had they been given rights. Many Republicans who were still in control of the Congress after the Civil War wanted to give full-on citizenship to African Americans, not only because it was the right thing to do, but also because that would make African Americans a powerful voting bloc that would vote for the Republicans. However, not surprisingly, many white Southern Democrats were very much against this idea. So, this is the second half of the political cartoon we saw. Shall I forgive these men, but not this man? The second half of this political cartoon, this African-American soldier who lost a leg during the war, should he not be given the same rights and citizenship as all of those Southerners who left the United States during the Civil War? So let's look at some of the competing plans for Reconstruction. Even while this war is going on, different members of the government were creating their own ideas for Reconstruction. This included Congress, this included Lincoln, this included other people as well. So Lincoln had a plan that called for an easy welcoming back of the southern states into the Union. He wanted to make it simple and easy. He wanted the South to be welcomed back into the United States as quickly as possible. So he called for a 10% plan. Basically, he said as soon as 10% of one state's voters signed a loyalty oath, they could write their own state constitution and bring their state back into the United States. Now, so long as this, the only caveat, the only hanging on thing was that the state constitution had to guarantee the abolition of slavery. Then they could come back into the United States. So it's simple, easy, fast, quick, and painless. Lincoln also wanted to pardon most of the Southerners who had fought in the Civil War, except for the higher-ups, who he felt, he wasn't hugely keen on the whole idea, but, guys like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis could not be pardoned quite so easily. He also thought that we should repay white Southerners for any lost property. Now, Lincoln's plan did not guarantee social and political equality for African Americans. He basically created a Reconstruction plan that would make the South come back as quickly as possible. Now, the ones who were opposed to this are known as the Radical Republicans. They are the Republicans within Abraham Lincoln's own party who are very much against this idea of, the easy welcoming back. They said the South had committed atrocious crimes, both slavery itself and starting the Civil War. And the Radical Republicans, led by guys like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, they wanted complete citizenship for African Americans, including the right to vote for these African Americans. They also wanted harsher punishments for the South. They wanted the South to pay money to freed African Americans. They supported the 40 acres and a mule plan. So here's Charles Sumner. He was the one who was nearly beaten to death with a cane. And here's Thaddeus Stevens, 1792 to 1868. Born in Vermont, but he was a Pennsylvania congressman for many years. He was born with a club foot and walked with a limp. And allegedly, one of the reasons he was so adamantly pro-African American rights was because he was allegedly in a relationship with his partly African American housekeeper, who may have actually been his common law wife for over 20 years. Now, the radical Republicans passed what's called the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. Remember, the Civil War is still on in 64. It required 50% loyalty oaths, not 10%. So half of the state has to say, yes, we are back. It also said that African Americans would be fully equal and have voting rights. However, this was passed at the very end of 1864, so Lincoln did what's called a pocket veto, which is basically he put it in a drawer. Since this passed at the end of the congressional term, Lincoln refused to sign it, and since the term ended and the bill had not been signed, the bill basically died. So that is what's called a pocket veto. Now, radical Republicans were also trying to get a bill through that would help African Americans by setting up what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was passed. The goal was to provide food and clothing and health care, and especially education for African Americans in the South. Now, they also worked to help reunite families that had been divided by slavery, although remember, slavery had been going on for hundreds of years at this time. Families were well and truly split, and so oftentimes they put notices in newspapers asking if anyone had seen any of their kinfolk. The Freedmen's Bureau lasted until 1872, when the then President Andrew Johnson basically killed the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll get to Johnson in a minute. So this is a Freedmen's School. You can see Freedmen's School is up above the door there. And also you can see that it's not just kids who are going and getting an education in the Freedmen's Bureau schools. These were open to anyone, African American, who wanted an education at this time. And you can see that many people took them up on that offer. Also, here's a newspaper article searching for relatives. And as you can see, it's hard because, you're looking for, I'm looking for my son who was sold into slavery away from me 30 years ago. It's going to be very difficult to find that child. Now, let's look at Andrew Johnson. Lincoln was assassinated. He was killed in April of 1865. This is the beginning of his second term. His vice president was a man named Andrew Johnson, and so Johnson becomes president of the United States. This is our 17th president, Andrew Johnson. He was in power from 1865 to 69, from North Carolina, but he lived most of his life in Tennessee. In Tennessee, Johnson was a congressman, a governor, the military governor of Tennessee during the Civil War, and became Lincoln's vice president during his second term. He is also the only president to become a senator after becoming a president, and he is also the first president to ever face impeachment. We'll get to that in a sec. So, Andrew Johnson, like Abraham Lincoln, wanted the South back as quickly as possible. He wanted this to be a pretty quick and painless, partially because he was a Southerner himself, and many of his critics said that he sort of had Southern sympathies. Andrew Johnson was offering pardons. He gave most of the land that had been given to the former slaves in the 40 acres and a mule, back to the Southerners. He did, however, require every state coming back into the Union to accept that slavery was ended. He also, forced wealthy planters and Confederate leaders to basically write him personally for a pardon. So they had to beg and grovel at his feet. Johnson was a Southerner, like I said. However, he did have a grudge against the rich, aristocratic white landowners, the former slave owners in the South. Johnson had been born very poor, and he was one of the only Southern lawmakers to stay with the Union after his state left. So that's kind of what made him vice president, actually. However, he didn't really have any interest in allowing African Americans things like the right to vote or full equality or the right to serve as elected officials. In fact, he was known to be pretty openly against equality for African Americans and was a pretty firm believer in states' rights, too. So, with Johnson as president, many Southern states were able to limit the power of newly freed African Americans because they realized that he was not going to step in and advocate on their side. Freedman, by the way, is the term I keep using as a term for an enslaved person who has been freed. By the time Congress reconvened, most of the former Confederate states had met the easier conditions of Johnson's welcoming back into the Union. So here is Andrew Johnson as a magician reuniting the North and the South in this political cartoon. Now, Southern states very quickly crushed a lot of the hopes. There was a lot of hope amongst African Americans that, this would be the start of something new, that, citizenship would be next, and full equality, and the right to vote, and things like that. However, a lot of these dreams were very quickly squashed by Southern states on a state-by-state level. They sent former Confederates to Congress, and they put in a bunch of laws, what were called black codes. These laws had the purpose of limiting African American rights and keeping them as landless workers. Basically, it almost reverted them back into slavery with very few exceptions. Radical Republicans, however, who were in charge of Congress, refused to seat these Southern lawmakers, and this is actually going to be important when we get to the 14th Amendment. Now, black codes restricted African Americans. It said they could only have certain types of jobs, mainly being farm laborers or servants, basically the jobs they had back when they were enslaved. Some black codes permitted African Americans from owning land or traveling without permission from their employer. Any African Americans who didn't have a job could be arrested as vagrants and put into prison. And these prisons were not just keeping them locked up. These prisons were work camps like Angola in the South, which was a prison that basically put them to work in the fields. Basically, black codes were reestablishing slavery under a different name. Now, radical and moderate Republicans were very unhappy with how the South was ignoring Reconstruction, and they were very unhappy. They were unhappy enough to refuse, like I said, seating these new Southern congressmen. But radicals also wanted to send troops back into the South and basically enforce Reconstruction at the point of a gun. Johnson, however, said that the radicals in Congress were trying to Africanize the South, which is a pretty mean way of putting it. Johnson vetoed a bill that would continue to fund the Freedmen's Bureau. When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1876, this law said that African Americans would be guaranteed civil rights at the national level. Johnson vetoed that too. However, what we're going to see is that the Republicans in Congress have the votes and the numbers to overturn Johnson's vetoes. So we're going to see this several times. So it's radical Republicans in Congress versus the president. So here is Andrew Johnson using the veto to kick out the Freedmen's Bureau with all the people inside of it too. Now let's look at the congressional plan for Reconstruction. As Congress was getting angrier and angrier about Andrew Johnson and his refusal to pass new laws, and the fact that he kept vetoing these laws, and the fact that the violence in the South was growing, they voted to override Johnson's veto, and the Civil Rights Bill actually passed. So like I said, they had the votes in Congress to override the presidential veto. However, radical Republicans in Congress were worried that a law like this is temporary. It could be overturned. It could be rewritten. It could be written out. And so instead, they wanted to put these rights into the Constitution and guarantee them forever. So Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1868. This guaranteed equal rights to all citizens of the United States. It said that if you were born in the United States, you were also a citizen of the United States, and completely got rid of the Three-Fifths Compromise. It said all citizens are citizens with the equal rights of citizens. If any state refused to give rights to African Americans, they would lose seats in Congress as a way to punish them. Also, and this was another important thing, it banned the seating of elected officials from the Confederacy. Basically, it said that if you were part of the rebellion against your country, then you are not allowed to sit in Congress after that. And this is a very interesting one, especially because the 14th Amendment became very important in the 1960s, and it is also being used in the 2020s as a way to talk about the insurrection that happened on January 6th, 2021. Should people who participated in it get to participate in government anymore? Congress also passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military zones. Basically, they said, we're sending the troops back into the South. Every zone was controlled by American Northern soldiers, and they were there to protect the rights of African Americans and to make sure that the South was following the conditions of Reconstruction. Now, once these states had written a new constitution, ratified the 14th Amendment, and signed enough "I promise not to do this again" pledges, these southern states would be allowed back into the Union. So here are the 5 military districts. Each of these is controlled by a northern general. So we see down there like Schofield and Sickles and Pope and Ord and Sheridan. These were all Civil War generals. And so now they are down there making sure that their districts are following the rules that are set up during Reconstruction. Now, Congress, however, continued to pass laws in spite of this, in spite of Johnson vetoing a lot of these laws. They would pass them, Johnson would veto them, and then they would override the veto. Eventually, however, they decided that they had had enough of Andrew Johnson. Congress passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that the president was not allowed to remove any appointees like secretaries of state or defense or anything like that without congressional approval. They did this partially because they wanted to keep Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War, and it was partially sort of, they were almost daring Andrew Johnson to ignore this law that they had made, or to veto it, or to act in resistance to it. And Andrew Johnson did just that. Andrew Johnson fired Edwin Stanton, and Congress jumped on the opportunity to use this defiance of the Tenure of Office Act to impeach Andrew Johnson. To impeach a president is to charge a president with wrongdoing. Now, it's important to realize that an impeachment is not an immediate removal from office. It is charging the president with an illegal act and then putting the president on trial. And if the president's found guilty, which has never happened, by the way, then you can remove them from office. He was tried in the Senate. However, the Senate did not get enough votes to find him guilty or remove him from office. They needed one more vote to do so. So Andrew Johnson stayed in office. However, he was pretty well healed by this. He promised to abide by Reconstruction laws after that. So here is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And here's a ticket to watch the impeachment, which was apparently a very hot item at the time. Now, we've passed the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. We passed the 14th Amendment, which said that all people born in the United States are citizens of these United States. And then in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant became president, winning partially due to the power of the newly freedmen voting for him. So nearly all African Americans in the South voted Republican, which makes sense considering that the Republicans were the ones who freed them. We also see that many African Americans were becoming politicians at this time as well. So in 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights for all men. Now, that works well at the national level. However, at the state level, the states were finding big loopholes that they could use to stop people from voting. So they did things like putting in literacy tests, or property qualifications, or what's called a poll tax, where you had to pay a certain amount of money to vote. Also, by the way, this did only apply to men. So here's our new president, Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 77, from Ohio, but he lived everywhere. He was in the army, so he moved all over the place, including Illinois and St. Louis, Missouri. He was a former lieutenant general of the United States. Now he was born Hiram Ulysses Grant, but allegedly he changed his name because he didn't want his initials to be Hug. Another story I heard is that he simply didn't care and ignored it when he somebody changed his name and he was like, fine. He was also allegedly supposed to be at the theater with Lincoln the night Lincoln was shot, but his wife did not like Mrs. Lincoln, and so they turned down the offer. Now, here are the three plans that you should know. So I would say pause right here and take notes on these three different plans for Reconstruction.